Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is our second video covering the second Brandon Sanderson book within the Wheel of Time, Towers of Midnight, the penultimate book of the series. And we have quite a bit to get to this week because last week's diary was supposed to cover right about the first quarter of the book, and therefore this week was going to cover the second quarter of the book. But I only got through, I want to say, a little bit less than 20%, so less than a fifth through the book last week, but I still managed to just about reach the halfway point this week, and it ended up working out pretty well. But that means that we have a solid like 30% of the book to get through today, as opposed to 20% last week, and last week's diary was barely under an hour. All of the Gathering Storm diaries were over an hour, so I'm scared about how long this video is going to be. We have a lot to get through today, so I don't really want to waste much time. In fact, there's quite a bit of information from this week's reading that I have consolidated or just straight up not included in my notes because it was not important enough to include the details of some of these things. I've noticed when it comes to the diaries, I've definitely erred more on the side of, at least with the last few of these books, definitely more towards straight up summary, and that's not the way that I want these things to go. I want to be like covering the broad strokes of what happens in any given storyline, plus a little bit of my thoughts on that more so. So I think I'm going to be trying to force myself to do that a little bit more today, so that if it's long, it's more because it's my thoughts rather than just straight up summarizing anything. I spent about just about 9.5 hours reading over the course of this last week, getting us up to the point for this diary, compared to 6.5 hours from last week. My total is a little over 15.5. It's between 15.5 and 16 hours of the book read so far, but like I said, just about 9.5 of those hours were just this week. So like I said, again, we have a lot to get through. So for spoiler-free impressions, I do actually have a little bit more to say this week compared to last week as far as spoiler-free content goes. I'm still really enjoying what this book has to offer. I've been really enjoying getting a little bit more from some of the storylines that we didn't see much of, if at all, compared to The Gathering Storm. In The Gathering Storm, we didn't have any Elaine plotline, and we did not have a whole ton of Matt or Perrin. This week, comparatively, the bulk of what I'm going to be covering is Matt and Perrin and Elaine. So, you know, you have a Caemlyn storyline here where Matt and Elaine are together, and we're going to switch back and forth between them a couple of times. And then we have a little bit going on with Perrin. This week, there's a little bit less with Perrin to talk about. A lot of it's a little bit more on the back end with him personally as a character as opposed to his plot. So that should go by relatively quick later in the video. But the one thing that I do want to note as far as how I'm feeling about the book and the way that it is structured, one thing that I really loved about The Gathering Storm was the way that POV allocation and storyline advancement was handled. Even though there were a couple points where jumping back and forth one chapter to the next, to the next, to the next between two plot lines instead of having 2 chapters with one plot line and 2 chapters with the next. There were times where that felt a little bit arbitrary, but I was kind of down for it. It definitely made the pace of reading through that book a little bit more fresh, a little bit quicker. I enjoyed getting to go through that in that way. Towers of Midnight is following a sort of similar approach, but also a little bit worse in my opinion, because there's a lot of chapters, especially in this week's reading, as you get closer to the halfway point of Towers of Midnight, where you have multiple storylines, multiple POVs that are being combined into chapters, but again in a pretty arbitrary way, where some of those times where that's happening, they're completely unrelated to each other, and it just feels like they're there for maybe pacing purposes, but I ironically feel like the pacing is a little bit worse as a result. For example, we'll get into this especially later on, but there's like a little bit of auxiliary POV stuff that happens that's broken in with Perrin's storyline a lot in those chapters, but there's a few chapters towards the end of this week's reading that split POV allocation and storyline stuff in really strange ways that just don't really work for me. Like, there's a portion of Matt and Elaine's storyline in Caemlyn that goes from chapters 22 through 24, but there's also scenes from the White Tower plotline and Perrin's plotline and Borderlands stuff going on, cut in between Matt and Elaine's stuff within those 3 chapters alone, which all in all feels really weird and kind of incoherent, and I just wasn't really a fan of the way that things are starting to be split a little bit more in this book, which actually has me a little bit worried about Memory of Light to a degree, because I know that book has multiple POVs every single chapter, but we'll see about that, but that's a few weeks away. Today, I just want to go through what all's going on in all the major storylines, because most of the major storylines are still pretty much separate, which is why I'm a little bit confused by the way that they're being like smushed together into some chapters in ways that doesn't really work. Like the Caemlyn storyline stuff, chapters 22 through 24, should have just been like 2 chapters of Matt and Elaine together doing the things that those chapters were doing at the time. And then the other stuff could have been split like in 21 or in a chapter before and after, instead of mixed in between. That's, a lot of it's arbitrary, and I can see a couple of reasons why some of these decisions had to be made. First of all, with the timeline, especially with regard to Perrin's timeline, you're kind of having to obscure the fact that things are a little bit broken in terms of where his storyline is trying to catch up to the rest while the others are still trying to move forward. But in that sense, I feel like it would have been just better to have a lot of Perrin in the first quarter of the book, instead of trying to split him out the way that he's been so far in this week's reading particularly. And then there's also the fact of, well, like I said, there's trying to obscure the fact that the timeline in some places is a little bit weird. But there's also the argument of pacing, where I just think it's not really working. But so those are my impressions for this week's reading, where I'm still enjoying it. There's a lot of good stuff that happened this week, but there's a lot that I'm a little bit more relatively mixed on account of just the way that it is split in the book itself, structurally speaking. So a little bit more of a personal taste issue, I confess, on that front. But in either case, this week we are covering chapters 11 through 25. That is 15 entire chapters, with no small amount of those chapters being quite long, actually. We're halfway through the book at this point. Well, I'm 1 chapter shy of being halfway through the book, but we're basically halfway through the book at chapter 26, and there's over 30 chapters remaining. So that kind of goes to show that there was quite a few chapters in this week's reading, especially, that were quite lengthy. Like there was a stretch of, I want to say it was 8 chapters, where every chapter was just about 20 pages, whereas the average for Sando's books in here has been less than 15 pages per chapter. So relatively speaking, there was a stretch where things were a little bit longer. But that is going to wrap up my spoiler-free thoughts for this week's reading so far. Let's go ahead and start getting into the spoiler talk here. And I actually had to spend a lot of time just trying to figure out what was going on when, and therefore be able to make a coherent semi-quote-unquote summary of sorts to actually go through what's happening in each storyline for the purposes of the diary here. So we're going to be basically covering all the storylines just one after another, just the same as last week. That means that we're going to be jumping back and forth between a lot of chapters. I'm probably not going to be indicating what is happening in what chapter a lot of time, because I'm just trying to cover what's going on in the storylines rather than summarizing everything piece for piece. But to start off this week's spoiler talks, we're going to be covering stuff that's happening in the Borderlands, because it's pretty separate from all of the main storylines going on. So we'll have a few scenes to talk about there at the start. Then we're going to cover a little bit of what's going on with Rand specifically in the early portions of this week's reading, because there were a couple chapters that still had his stuff going on directly early on in the reading, so we'll go through some of that. And that will lead us directly into talking about the White Tower stuff that happens in the week's reading, which starts occurring right afterwards, and which, is also in a weird way pretty much separate, despite the fact that there are characters from some of the other storylines that are involved. We'll get a little bit more into the details of that later. It's kind of being sandwiched a little bit by some of the stuff happening in Rand's storyline. based off of some of what we covered last week, actually, given that Rand visited the White Tower very early on in the book. But then, following the White Tower plotline, we're going to cover the Caemlyn stuff, and that'll switch back and forth a couple of times between Elaine and Matt, because all of that's going on in that one set location for those couple of POVs here. It'll be the first time that we're talking about Elaine since, Knife of Dreams, so that'll be a little bit fun. And then after we're done with all of that, we'll actually go and backtrack and start to cover Perrin's stuff a little bit. Ironically, because Perrin's stuff is happening before all of this is happening, well, all of the other stuff anyway. So it's ironic that I'm covering him last, but his material is so separate from everything else that's going on at this point that I felt like it was worth just gathering it all together, and then we'll cover it at the end, especially since, like I said, his material is a little bit less plot-centric compared to the other POVs, so it should be a little bit easier to just breeze through. In fact, when I was composing my notes and doing basically my chapter summaries and my notes in order so that I could cover them for the diary here, Perrin's stuff by far had the most stuff that I just kind of glossed over or skipped over even in my notes, because it's mostly personal detail stuff that is not particularly relevant for the purposes of my diary. So we'll do that, and then we'll have one final Rand chapter at the very end to talk about to wrap the whole thing up, because that chapter is, well, because of arbitrary reasons, the reason why I chose to do that. But in either case, that is how we're going to structure things out approximately. So let's jump into what is happening in the Borderlands with the reading for the week. Not a whole lot to talk about, all things considered, but we will go ahead and talk about that. There is notably, the way that we started and ended last week's diary was with stuff going on from Lan's POV while he's traveling through the Borderlands trying to reach the old kingdom of Malkier, and he's been gathering a couple of companions along the way. We noted a couple of scenes last week where he first gathered one companion and then he gathered like 3 more, and chapter 23 contains a very brief scene where Lan's companions that he has been forced to basically allow to ride with him at this point have sneakily recruited several more followers with a bunch of supplies and food and stuff like that in order to join the crew. Lan does make his companions, all of them, promise that they're not going to actively try to recruit people anymore, but I suspect that he's still going to end up with more and more followers as he goes along anyway. But at the end of that scene, the group is now a good bit larger than it was. I can't remember if it said there were dozens of people, which I think sounds wrong. I think it might have just been around a dozen people. I forget the exact amount off the top of my head, of course, but the point is that the group has gotten exponentially larger. You know, it was 1, then it was 2, and then it was, what was it, 4 or 5, and now it's probably somewhere around a dozen, so it's just kind of like doubling each time or somewhere around that. So yeah, that's the point of that scene from chapter 23. Is just, hey, Lan's group is continuing to get larger. They're continuing to go towards Malkier. Cool beans. I'm looking forward to seeing how that continues to develop, even if it is just in these random scenes here and there that just announce that there's more people following. I don't know what's going to happen, but I've been enjoying those scenes as they have come up. But that is not the only storyline that has been going on within the Borderlands. There's also a few scenes intermixed alongside largely Perrin POV stuff in chapters 18, 21, and 24 from Rodo Iturralde's POV returning back to him, where following the Gathering Storm after Rand had sent him and his fellow Damani folk up to Saldea, specifically the city of Meridon, I believe, right up against the Blight to defend against, incoming hordes of Trollocs. And that's what these 3 scenes basically cover. There's a lot of little details of stuff going on here, some of which might be really important to mention, some of which might not be as important to mention. But the point is that these 3 scenes from Iturralde's POV are basically just defending Meridon from this massive Trolloc onslaught, basically, with the city, and specifically noting that the city itself, Meridon, the Saldeans, are not actually helping Iturralde defend their own city because they see the Damani as invaders and they do not like that the Damani are here. So there's some weird political tinged stuff going on, but still Iturralde is serving Rand by defending against the onslaught from the Blight going on. So there is a scene in which, the Trollocs are starting to set up some trebuchets, and they're using those to launch people into the camps that are up against the Blight. There's a map shown where you have, like, the Blight up here, basically. There's a couple camps where Iturralde and co are, like, defending against a narrow passage where they're able to get through the Blight, and then you have a field down here, and then, like, Meridon down below, basically, is what's the organization of what's going on. So the Damani are here, Blight's up here, Trollocs are coming down, they're setting up stuff, starting to launch bodies, but it turns out that the trebuchets aren't actually set up yet. They're not being set to launch bodies of, like, dead Trollocs and whatever else into the defending Damani camps yet. It turns out that there's a bunch of Draghkar here, which who would have thought that those would have been forgotten about after, like, book 6 or something like that. Cough, cough, Jordanisms. Anyway, those are being used to just drop a bunch of bodies onto the Damani, like, firstly to injure them, but it includes some live bodies as well, so they're kind of like infiltrating the camp into some degree. Just interesting little battle tactics and stuff going on. There's further defenses made. I believe 21 is the next one of these scenes where the Trollocs have now, over the course of time, managed to take the hill upon which all the Damani were set there up against the Blight. Iturralde basically planning a retreat as they make a final holdout on the hill so that they can retreat and leave because they've done all that they can here, basically. There is a point in which one particular moment of Iturralde's leg actually being broken by his horse falling on top of it, so that is mega unfortunate, and it is at this point when, Iturralde's injured, when it turns out that the Saldeans have actually finally started to join the fight, and also allowing the Damani a chance to retreat properly into the city of Meridon. The impression that I got from some of these scenes, because my eyes kind of glazed over the combat a little bit, I will confess, but the impression that I got is that there is the political stuff going on within Meridon with the Saldeans and how they're dealing with the Damani, because in the next one of these scenes, Iturralde actually interacts with the person who is currently in charge of Saldea, while all of the Borderlander nobles are down south trying to deal with Rand, trying to get a meeting with Rand, which we'll mention very briefly a little bit later, but Iturralde's interacting with him and just like, yeah, well, all of the laws of the land and random alliances and past rivalries, all of this kind of political nonsense is in fact nonsense right now. I serve the Dragon Reborn. The last battle's approaching. The fact that you are not actually defending your own land against the Blight, against the forces of the Dark One, suggests that you might be a Dark Friend. Why in the world are you abandoning your own people like this by not helping? So, like, there's a little bit of political tension there, and it seems like there's a particular captain amongst the Saldeans named Yoli, who, I didn't get all of the details. It felt like there should have been something that clicked in my brain a little bit more than it did. It seems like Yoli kind of led a force of Saldeans who betrayed some of the other Saldeans in order to actually go forth and fight against the Blight and help the Damani there, being traitor to their countrymen, basically, and ended up killing some other Saldeans in the process. So Yoli's, like, kind of in hot water with his own leader because of that, but Iturralde's, like, trying to assure him that he shouldn't fear retribution or hanging or anything like that for doing what needed to be done, but Yoli is pretty intent on being punished for the deed anyway, because it was treacherous to do what he did, I guess. I don't know the details of what he actually did specifically. I felt like it wasn't really explained in enough detail, or like I said, my eyes might have just glazed over it because of some of the other combat going on within these scenes. But there is some interesting political stuff going on. In either case, Yoli and Iturralde planned to make Meridon where they make their last stand, basically, against the Blight here, now that Yoli basically commands the city, because of this sort of coup, I guess, that he unleashed against some of his fellow Saldeans. So you know, there's some stuff going on there that I'm not fully like cognizant of, that I didn't fully get, but in either case, I have still been enjoying what's been going on with Ituralde up there in the Borderlands. I'm looking forward to seeing more, and especially looking forward to seeing if that connects with like the one prologue scene that we got last week from, what is the place called? Kandor? Yeah, the nation nearby called Kandor, where we had that one POV of defending against the massive onslaught of Trollocs and Myrddraal and stuff from the Blight. So that's all stuff that I'm looking forward to maybe being able to see a little bit later. But that covers everything from the Borderlands from this week's reading. We're going to move on to Rand's storyline personally. And there's some good stuff here at the beginning of this week's reading from all of that. You know, there's, I believe, no small amount of Rand's storyline from this week's reading actually comes from other POVs. Like one of them, a couple of them are from Min's POV, one of them is from Nynaeve's POV, so not all of it is from Rand himself. So we get a little bit more of that external view of him that I really enjoy seeing so much. I enjoy Rand more as a character from other people's POV than from his own POV most of the time, which is so funny to me. But anyway, yeah, we're going to jump back to chapters 12 and 13 and 15. That'll cover some of Rand's storyline. So the main thing worthy of note is that following the end of Gathering Storm, of course, that saw Rand kind of running off, nearly killing his father in, you know, rage because Cadsuane basically influenced him to talk to him, and Rand felt manipulated, and he was going to go off and basically destroy the Shan-Chan all on his own, and then he wasn't able to because he sicked up quite a bit from trying to use the one power, and he was able to escape. He ended up on Dragonmount, reconciled with his inner self, with Lews Therin a little bit, understood a little bit more of his purpose in the world, and now has this radiant feeling of warmth about him, a radiant feeling that even Min, as, you know, who's been bonded, or who has technically bonded him alongside Elaine and Aviendha, but in either case, Min is able to feel through the bond with Rand this radiant warmth about Rand that has happened recently, and she is able to assure some of the others that she's interacting with, such as Nynaeve, that Rand is okay. Despite the fact that he has disappeared for a few days, he is fine, he is okay, and she is resisting telling them which approximate area he is at the moment, because she's sure that he's going to come back and he's going to be better, obviously. And this is basically what happens, you know. But Min and Nynaeve are interacting about Rand in this way, and the two of them are summoned to Cadsuane to investigate the sudden disappearance of Alanna, which may or may not be related to what happened with Rand. We're not entirely clear on this point, but Alanna has disappeared all of a sudden. She's left basically nothing behind. She gathered up all of her possessions, left Tyr with basically no trace. The others are a little bit concerned that she can be used against Rand to some degree, because, you know, they don't really know what her affiliation is or anything like that, and if the Dark One or Forsaken or somebody is able to get a hold of Alanna, they could use her to lead them to Rand, of course, because Alanna is still, you know, Rand is still her warder as well, technically. They are bonded together. But, you know, so there's a little bit of questions about Alanna going on here that has not been addressed further yet in this book. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there, but there is a question mark with regard to what happened with Alanna. But, you know, in this conversation, Min does kind of suddenly gasp and look towards a specific direction within the city of Tyr to indicate that Rand has actually returned now. So they were kind of waiting on Rand to return. Min was assuring everybody else that he would, and alas, he does return in the chapter, and he is expressively pretty happy for once, you know. When asked about Alanna, he just says that she's gone north somewhere, but otherwise that she can't pose much danger to him. I'm not entirely sure what specifically is going on with Alanna there, but I'm sure we'll figure it out at some point, maybe. But so that's something that's happening. But Rand does apologize once again to the Aiel. You know, he expresses that he has told to the Aiel for disappearing on them again without informing them, and the danger that he put himself in for what he was doing. He promises that he won't do anything like it again, and that he will meet his toe. And again, just as mentioned, he is expressively happy for once. It's a kind of a strange thing for him to like not be this very kind of intimidating, cold personality like he was in The Gathering Storm, where he was legitimately scary at points, and he's not that anymore. He's definitely not that. And so the way that he's able to express his feelings and express his apologies and all of this stuff is like honestly a really kind of heartwarming sequence. I really enjoyed reading that, just the stark difference of Rand between the last book and this one, and for it to feel deserved because of this massive character moment, this massive personal character climax that occurred in The Gathering Storm. Really, really great stuff. But so the rest of chapter 13 is basically set on Rand setting some of the others around him to do multiple different little tasks. First of all, the one of these things, I guess I forgot that this was going to be mentioned this early. Rand sets some of the Aiel, I forget off the top of my head who specifically, but he sets some of the others to go inform the Borderlander nobles in Farmatting that he accepts their terms to meet with them. So that's something that we'll get to see pretty soon, as him meeting with them, I'm sure. And like I said, that kind of addresses what question marks of what's going on in Saldea specifically, with that one person who's in charge of Meridon, in charge of the country basically while the nobles are gone, and what the dynamic between them is at. I remember the noble mentioning at one point in the conversation with Iturralde in that chapter about the Borderlander nobles going down to try to capture Rand or something like that. I forget the wording, but there was some like sort of subtext to that was a little bit more interesting than the exact way that it was put might initially lead one to inherently believe. But anyway, Rand does now agree to the Borderlanders' terms to meet with them, so he wants people to go off to let them know that. He makes Darlin the new king of Tyr at this point, he's appointed to lead Tyr. He has Darlin proclaim about Egwene's succession to the Amyrlin, so that's something that is now news to some of the folk down in Tyr. He wants to make that news public, that there is a new Amyrlin. He rescinds his exile upon Cadsuane, and also sets her on a sort of vague task to find somebody specific. Whatever's going on there, again, no idea. We'll probably see a little bit later, but he has something for Cadsuane specifically to do following rescinding her exile, which was also an interesting little interaction that occurs. And he also says that he plans to return to Erad Daman soon, and that is something that we see in the very last chapter that we're going to cover this week at the very end of this sequence, I guess. Or I guess I will go ahead and just cover it at the end of, what I'm covering with Rand here, because might as well, because it just makes more sense to group all of Rand all together. But in either case, the end of this chapter specifically sees Rand forming some of the High Lords and Ladies of Tyr together in the city and confronting them personally in a way that he's able to weed out both Werimon and Anayela as dark friends, which was an interesting development. I didn't necessarily see that coming, but he does weed out a couple of the High Lords and Ladies as dark friends, has them, basically cast out of Tyr, and so there's some more of that political stuff going on, Rand weeding people out, making these couple characters uncomfortable so that he's able to determine that, hey, you guys are dark friends, what are you guys doing here? And then basically sends them away. So that's something interesting that happens. And also there's another little character moment that occurs when Tam arrives into the meeting room here, and Rand personally apologizes to him for what he just about did in the last book, of course, for his misdeeds, for nearly killing his own father, for which Tam obviously forgives him, and he also does a personal introduction of Min, for example, so you get to see a little bit of that more happy personal side of things. Just like, this is somebody very special to me, meet her. And Tam's like, well, I already know her. And Rand's just like, yes, but I did not introduce you yet. So again, just the difference in Rand's personality is something that I find very satisfying and honestly kind of cute in a way. It's really, really enjoyable. But the next chapter from Rand's POV does see him, let's see, it's something about returning to Tyr as well. from some other excursion, I guess, whatever was going on. But in either case, there is a scene from Nynaeve's POV where she and Naeth are inspecting a part of the city of Tyr where there is a bubble of evil that kind of just destroyed everything, left a whole sphere of stuff just absolutely destroyed. And by destroyed, it means like an absolute husk of itself, where just touching some of those things would cause it to collapse into piles of dust, basically. So you have like entire buildings and a bunch of different people who are just unsavable, like just so dead that like the moment you touch them, they just collapse into piles of dust. Really interesting kind of visual stuff that's going on there. The two of them, Nynaeve and Naeth. Naeth is one of the Ashaman, but Nynaeve and Naeth are investigating this portion of the city where this bubble of evil occurred and gather up all of that dust together, and Nynaeve burns it up, discovering that if any of that happened to be lit ablaze, you know, at the way that it was before they gathered it up into just a small pile to burn it, that it could have done massive additional destruction to the city if that fire happened and then was able to actually catch some of the other buildings nearby. So some other interesting stuff going on with the way that bubbles of evil work, since they're all kind of like different and unique a little bit, but this is a particularly nasty one. Nynaeve, in her, basically her personal despair for all intents and purposes of not being able to actually help save anybody. None of these people who were caught in the bubble of evil could be saved. They, just like all the buildings and everything, just there was nothing to save. They were so dead, they were just gone, crumbling into piles of dust, of course. So she's pretty distraught by this. She randomly decides that she's going to delve Naeth, though, which is a really really cool moment. I just love all these things with Nynaeve when she's like discovering new things or experiencing things that are impactful for her personal character. This is one of those moments where she delves into Naeth just out of curiosity. Up to this point, Naeth's been kind of like rambling a few times about being able to see Myrddraal in the shadows randomly in Tyr. Just like, why are they not attacking? I see Myrddraal in the shadow over there, and like, why is he not doing anything? When he's basically like convinced himself that he has a talent, essentially, for just being able to detect where Myrddraal are. But no, it's just that he's partially insane because of the taint on saidin while he was using it during the time while it was still tainted. But Nynaeve delves into his mind and actually is able to encounter this actual like madness in and of itself. It's kind of described as like prickling barbs that are like stuck into different portions of his mind where the insanity has crept in. And not only is Nynaeve able to detect this, she's also able to heal it in some sense by like actually picking those barbs out of the figurative brain. I'm not entirely sure like what the literality of all of that is, but she's able to heal the madness essentially by just picking some of these little barbs out of the mind. And Naeth essentially is immediately healed. Like, he stops seeing Myrddraal. He's like, this talent that I thought I had was just me being crazy, and I don't feel crazy anymore. This is insane. And that was a really cool moment, you know, kind of the same as when Nynaeve discovered accidentally how to heal stilling / gentling. Some of these different types of discoveries, which are really cool moments within the entire series up to this point. Nynaeve has another one of those. Loved it a ton. She does definitely suspect that this madness, however, is kind of akin to compulsion. And kind of the way that it's described with delving into the mind and prickling barbs out does seem pretty similar to compulsion. So that's an interesting little note to add there. But Rand, like I said, does return to Tyr and from somewhere and finds Nynaeve in the city over there and talks to her. He tells her about how he has been delaying the last battle and how he feels like that has been to some degree a little bit of a mistake to delay the last battle, because it's making the bubbles of evil, the corruption, all that kind of stuff worse, because the longer that it goes, the more powerful the Dark One becomes, so he shouldn't be delaying it anymore if possible. He conveys his plan to Nynaeve to open the door to break the seals to the Dark One's prison, and he asks for Nynaeve to be there with him when he goes to, you know, actually deal with that, to be one of the two women who links with him to actually wield Kalimdor properly. And she actually agrees to do it. She agrees to the request, and eventually, you know, kind of comes to inside. He's a little bit dubious about the plan to, break the seals to the prison, of course. But when Rand explains it, she's able to like come to his side enough to be like, yeah, I kind of see what you mean here. Like that this move actually makes a little bit of sense. And she does agree to go to the boar with him. There's also another couple of personal character interactions, including Rand telling Nynaeve to not forsake all of her own personality, all of what makes her her, in the pursuit of becoming an Aes Sedai. The way that Aes Sedai basically like shirk all of their emotions and stuff like that. Rand expresses to her personally with this newfound knowledge that he has. He's just like, hey, cutting off all of your own emotions maybe isn't the wisest thing, so don't do that, please. Like, part of what makes you you is the fact that you are not like all of this. All of the Aes Sedai that I've known and trusted the most are the ones who are the least like all of the other Aes Sedai. So like, just don't lose yourself in this pursuit, he warns her. So that was a nifty little interaction, and is also paired along with Nynaeve also delving in his mind. She explains to him, it's just like, I just healed Nynaeve from the madness, by the way. And so she delves into Rand's mind and finds like absurd amounts of this madness that is at Rand's brain. Just like, how in the world did you not just like die with all of this going on here? But she also notices that these barbs are like kind of shielded by a layer of light, which presumably is what he experienced there at the very end of the Gathering Storm up on Dragonmount, was this enlightenment moment where this barrier of light was able to separate him from this stark madness or whatever was going on. But the fact that he had the strength to resist all of the madness that was going on in his head is something that she finds rather insane, because it is quite crazy. But yeah, so that's something that she finds. She's not able to actually heal him in that moment because it's too much to take care of, but she does promise to Rand to heal the other Ashaman that are nearby in Tyr before she goes back to the White Tower, because she does need to go back to the White Tower in order to do a couple of things, including take her testing, which is actually going to take us into the White Tower plotline for the week's reading, where some of these interactions actually occur. You have a little bit of interchange with some of these chapters where, again, the timing of when exactly some of these things are happening is a little bit not super clear, but it's general enough that it doesn't really make that much difference. But real quickly, before we actually hit up the White Tower plotline, Rand does also have one chapter at the very end of this week's reading, in chapter 25, where he actually does travel to Bandar Aban, to Erra Daman, with Min, and we get to see a little bit more of what I was referencing a bit, or rather what I will be referencing with regard to the next chapter in the actual White Tower, is Rand's presence, actually having an effect upon the places that he goes to. He goes to Bandar Aban, the clouds clear a little bit, sky clears a little bit, things warm up a little bit, and things just are not going well in the city, but they start to go really well really quickly, because Rand makes apologies for his abandonment of the city to some people, including some former soldiers, real quick. Through his tavern nature and through this much warmer personality, he's actually like very quickly able to get like a sort of small army starting to get put together within the city, so that they can gather and start putting the city right in and of themselves as their own people. His presence has, like I said, done good in some other places, but they also all do some good here, because the group goes to the docks of Bandar Aban, where some of the sea folk have been waiting to be able to offload some of their food, because they've not been allowed to offload food, because all of the food that has been opened on the ships is just completely destroyed and unusable, unedible. People are basically able to kill themselves on the food, and the dockmaster's just like, I'm not allowing this anymore. But Rand, his presence basically fixes all of the rest of the food, and so they open up all the rest of the food. It's just like, hey, all the food's good actually, so start actually taking care of the city, start getting things put together, start getting things set right. And yeah, that's basically what he does. He says that he's going to stay for a day in the capital of Erra Daman here, and the people are in charge of setting themselves free. Like, he's not going to invade. He doesn't have any of his own forces. All the people of the city doing it. He's going to give them a day to really start to get things set before he goes off to do some of the other stuff that he needs to get done. And that is the end of Rand's plotline for this week. In the White Tower plotline, You have occurrences like Egwene visiting Tel'aran'rhiod and, reflecting on some of the positive things that have been happening in the city since Rand's presence was there. This is something that we see a little bit of a motif. And whenever he enters a city where there's like a bunch of heavy cloud cover or something like that, whenever he arrives in a city, it's pretty clear that he's there because like the skies clear up a little bit. And there's also stuff like in the case of Tar Valon, which Egwene is reflecting on here, food being found in places where there wasn't food, or food not being spoiled, or things that people are consuming like tea or something like that tasting better, basically as a result of his presence, which is honestly really cool. Like I just really like the imagery associated with all that. I like there being a physical indicator, a real legit indicator in the world of what his presence is, not just for the people personally, but on the things, and how he's like an active improvement upon the world wherever he is at. It just makes that moment at the end of the Gathering Storm that much more impactful for me. But in either case, Egwene's reflecting on some of this stuff, but within Tel'aran'rhiod, she does have a handful of different meetings. She has a good bit of stuff to talk about. For example, she visits Amis and Bear, a couple of the Aiel Wise Ones, and tells them about Rand's plan to open the bore, which they find concerning. They promise Egwene to talk to him about that because they're not entirely sure that that's a wise decision either. But they also aren't necessarily sure about Egwene's plans to resist him by, going to all of his allies and telling them to not let him do this thing. That's what Egwene wants to do, and the Aiel are like, I'm not sure that's going to work either, or that's the best thing to do, but we'll talk to Rand about this, opening the bore type of thing. But she does have that meeting. But the rest of the chapter is primarily meeting between her and Nynaeve and Elaine, for example, finally getting a hold of them. Like in last week's reading, we talked about how she touched Nynaeve's dreams one night and said, hey, we need to meet here pretty soon. So she has organized a meeting with these two. They are meeting here. Nynaeve comes in first, and, they kind of wander around a little bit while Egwene informs Nynaeve about what happened at the tower, like with the Shan-Chan attack and stuff like that. Egwene had set a ward in the throne room, to alert them to when Elaine would arrive. The ward goes off, they go back to the throne room, but nobody's there, which they find a little bit strange, even though Egwene pops up a little bit later. So Egwene's like, that's suspicious. So she sets another ward, and then continues to talk to Elaine and Nynaeve. It's revealed in this moment between the three of them that Elaine has bonded Rand. Egwene's able to pick up the fact that has happened. Nynaeve is able to detect that Elaine is pregnant. And there's some other interactions, so there's that information being revealed. There's also kind of like what I mentioned before with Rand explaining to Nynaeve some of what his plans are with regard to the bore, and Nynaeve being a little bit convinced by that. Egwene warns these two, obviously, that this is something that Rand plans to do and we need to not let that happen. But Nynaeve is like, maybe it's not such a bad thing, and tries to explain the other side of the POV there. But Egwene says that she's too caught up in Rand's Ta'veren nature and supporting him to, his plans at the bore is a little bit perhaps foolish to some degree. And then, of course, Egwene also calls the two of them back to the tower so that they can be properly raised to Aes Sedai. And Nynaeve does submit to this request to do so. She is able to push off Egwene's, worries about what's going to happen with her, because Nynaeve says that she, while she has been away, has not just been caught up in Rand's nature. She's actually been learning the weaves to do the raising, and so she's confident that she'll be able to do that. And Elaine is also basically, what's the term? I'm forgetting the word off the top of my head, but she's permitted to not come back to the tower to do the raising because of her pregnancy. The fact that the pregnancy really affects her ability to channel consistently, some other stuff like that. And also they're not sure if the testing would actually do harm against the babies or not. So she's just like, we'll figure out whether or not that's the case. You can stay in Caemlyn for now, and just kind of work on that a little bit later. But yeah, that's something that happens in the chapter. But of course, there is another confrontation in the moment as well. I forgot to even write this down somehow. It turns out that warding that was set off that we talked about a little bit earlier in the chapter, when Egwene and Nynaeve returned to the throne room and found that Elaine wasn't there even though the ward had gone off, that's because there were a couple Black Sisters that happened to arrive and kind of jump them, and they were able to, I think, kill one, and the other was able to escape, I believe is what happened. But there was a little bit of a skirmish between a couple of these and a couple of Black Aja, which is disconcerting. So yeah, I mean, good that there's a couple Black Aja down, but that is still something that happened. But so they all depart and go about their merry ways. The next chapter has that scene between Rand and Nynaeve that we talked about a little bit before. Elaine obviously goes back to Caemlyn to deal with her storyline that we'll talk about relatively shortly, I think we'll get to relatively shortly. And Egwene has a short POV at the end of chapter 15 as well, where she's meeting with a few of the hunters of the Black Aja, you know, from that entire arc of the series where that was going on in the tower. Egwene is meeting with some of them to discuss some theories about what's going on with the Oath Rod, because obviously Messiana being in the tower suggests that she somehow had a way to basically ignore the 3-0s or get past the 3-0s to some degree. And Egwene is learning from some of the others here that there is technically a few ways that this might have been able to happen, including one way which seems shockingly simple and very concerning. So continuing to get a little bit of developments with all of that. Let's see, what other White Tower stuff is there that's going on? A little bit later, because those were chapters 15 or 14 and 15 where that happened. Chapter 20 jumps us again to Nynaeve's POV, but she is back in the tower actually doing the test to be raised to Aes Sedai. And it felt like, while I was reading this felt like a really fun parallel here nearing the end of the series to the beginning of the series. I don't remember which chapter in the Great Hunt it was specifically. I'm going to go ahead and look out of curiosity, because I feel like it was somewhere in the chapter 20 range, like it was here. It's probably not exact. It is chapter 23 in the Great Hunt, but I loved that chapter when Nynaeve was going through the trials to become accepted, basically, where that was a really great chapter. It was the moment where my opinion on Nynaeve turned around, where I was not a fan of her in the Eye of the World at all. I thought she was a jerk and didn't really enjoy her very much. And in early Great Hunt, I also wasn't a very big fan, but seeing her experience in the testing, her overcoming that, and also, you know, the parts of her past and her personality that came through because of that test was something that really invested me in her character, even when she could be a little bit annoying sometimes. I've really liked Nynaeve ever since that moment in the Great Hunt. And chapter 20 of Towers of Midnight, you know, not just the second book in the series like the Great Hunt was, but the second to last book of the series here, where she's actually being raised properly to Aes Sedai, having a very similar occurrence where she goes through the test, weaving all 100 weaves in the Terra Angreal, being set forth against trials from various of the other Aes Sedai, including Egwene herself, giving her some of her toughest trials to like prove that she could get through those weaves and do that, was a really special moment. You know, there's some technicalities of what was going on in the scene, which include Nynaeve nearly failing the test, barely being accepted, or barely being actually raised to Aes Sedai by the passing the vote, basically, from the other women, because she did not retain the Aes Sedai calm that is normally accepted of people who are raised to the shawl, and she also did like a lot of running to the next weave, to the next task. She forsook the next task in some cases to like actually help and save some of the people that she was seeing within the visions and everything that was going on. There were some technicalities that like very nearly caused Nynaeve to fail the test. She does pass, barely, but there was a lot of question about whether that was going to be the case. There's just a lot of really meaningful stuff, you know. The details of what actually happened in the test I don't feel like really matter that much. The point is that she went through it, she passed, and it was a really, really great chapter. Maybe my favorite chapter of this book, which is also kind of relevant to The Great Hunt, where chapter 23 of The Great Hunt, her testing there, was maybe my favorite chapter of that book as well. So I feel like a lot of these moments for Nynaeve, like including like the breaking of her block was that in Crown of Swords when the breaking of her block happened? Obviously when she learned how to heal stilling / gentling, accidentally did so upon Logain. There's that moment that we just talked about, her discovering how to heal the madness of men. There's just a lot of these moments with Nynaeve specifically where even though she hasn't really been a main character since the first few books, basically, she has been, and she's been involved with main characters, but she's mostly been like secondary to other main characters in various storylines ever since probably like book 5 or so. After book 5 was another one of her moments where she defeated Moghedien. Just a lot of really cool stuff where Nynaeve's character is incredible, and I love getting to experience all of those moments. She might be my favorite of the who are all the main characters? Which one is my favorite? I would have to think about that a little bit more. But if we're talking about like favorite main characters, she is one of them for sure. I definitely love getting to see all of the stuff that happens with her, and I have loved getting to see all of that for just about the entire series. It was basically only Eye of the World that I didn't really like her. So, that goes to say something about her for me. But anyway, we do still have a lot more to get through, and this video is already 50 minutes long in my recording, so we're just going to jump forward and move on to some of the other White Tower stuff that's going on. With Gawain specifically, his POV is the White Tower POV for chapters 22 and 23. Of course, last time we talked about Gawain's POV last week was him being admonished by Egwene, told to not guard her door anymore at night because she doesn't want him to, for a couple of reasons, both for personal reasons and also because she has wards set up in her room and wants to be able to potentially catch anybody who might try to come into her room to do something to her. And that's basically exactly what we see happen in chapters 22 and 23, where Gawain's kind of wandering around the White Tower instead of guarding Egwene's door because she asked him not to. And so he has interactions with various different people in the chapter, including encountering some of his old youngling folk there, where they've opted out of becoming warders. They don't know if they really want to become warders to Aes Sedai, but they still don't really know what to do, and so, he promises to vouch for them to Chubane to see if they can get into the Tower Guard instead. So, Gawain's still looking out for his old youngling buddies who he used to lead. He also finds and talks to Gareth Bryne a little bit, and Bryne tries to give him a little bit of insight and knowledge about how he should better balance his personal goals with his passion, that he should focus a little bit more on himself instead of this romantic desire to be Egwene's warder, which has been causing him a lot of problems. He seems to have like an anxious attachment style that has been bothering Egwene a good bit. Of course, he is reminded how he as a kid was also one very led by passion, too impulsive of a person, we'll say, and Bryne tries to tell him that he should try to work on some of these things in and of himself, and Gawain's like a little bit put off by some of this, but he does wander around the tower a little bit more and finds himself inevitably back at Egwene's room, where he actually notices shadows basically moving. He notices an assassin in the shadows, and he has a little bit of a skirmish with this unknown assailant. He fights them off, and then goes to try to check on Egwene, where it is discovered that she had a ward on her room, and now an assassin knows that if the assassin had been able to get into Egwene's room, the ward would have gone off and might have been able to be caught, but now they know to be more cautious when trying to go after Egwene, and this is something that Egwene is very not pleased with him about, definitely berated by her for a little bit, making it harder to catch an assassin since, like I said, now they know that Egwene was basically waiting for the assassin to be able to make a move. So Egwene's very unhappy with Gawain about that. She leaves off a little bit, and Gawain has some more interactions with Chubane at the scene of the crime, so to speak. They find one of the assassin's knives. I believe it's noted that Gawain keeps the knife, I think, so it might be that is used to identify somebody later, but then again, maybe not, because after finding this knife and after Gawain asks Chubane to take the younglings into the Tower Guard, which he accepts, Gawain decides to ultimately leave Caemlyn and leave Tar Valon and go to Caemlyn instead to actually meet with his sister for the first time in a while. So yeah, Gawain's no longer in the White Tower and not part of that plot line anymore, so that's interesting to note. And speaking of Caemlyn, him going to Caemlyn, he does not appear in any of the Caemlyn storyline from this week's reading specifically, but we are going to move on to the Caemlyn storyline here, jumping through a couple of Elaine's scenes, and then into a few of Matt's scenes, and then Elaine again for a few more. So chapter 11 is actually the first Elaine POV since Knife of Dreams, where she is basically just navigating some court politics with regard to what's going on with some of the noble prisoners that she took from, the uprising in Caemlyn, where she was able to secure her throne. All of the nobles who did not support her and in fact fought against her are being held prisoner. There's some politics regarding what she should be doing with them. She's also learning a little bit about how the sea folk are kind of demanding the land that they were promised from agreeing to help Elaine with some things. Just different political stuff, but the main thing of note in chapter 11 is the fact that Elaine is determined to make a break for Carrion's throne. Now that she has secured the Lion Throne, is the Lion Throne Caemlyn, or is that Sun Throne? In either case, she holds Caemlyn now. She holds Andor, but now she's going to make for Carrion, because Rand has basically been holding that spot warm for her to go and make her claim for the throne, and she plans to go ahead and do that. Some of her friends and her advisors in Caemlyn are a little bit resistant to the idea of doing that, especially so soon after she has just secured Caemlyn, but she is planning to do that. And she's also a little bit unsure how she is going to manage to do that, but we'll get to the notes on that very shortly here. At the end of the chapter, Howin Nori also comes to tell her about some of the other nobles that are in the city. One in particular, Duhara, meeting with... Duhara is not one of the nobles. Duhara is the Aes Sedai who Elaida had tried to send to Caemlyn to try to hook Elaine into the White Tower plots, which Elaine absolutely refused, but Duhara has been meeting with some of the other nobles of Caemlyn after being rejected to be Elaine's advisor, and he has also brought news of a very impersonal letter from Matt demanding an audience with her, and she makes for one to be set up because she didn't realize that Matt was around Caemlyn. So she has that going on. There's a big question that I have about what's going on with Duhara and the other Caemlyn nobles right now, but it's not addressed in any of the rest of these chapters specifically. There is a little bit of other politics stuff that goes on, but again, we'll get there in a little bit. In either case, Elaine also arranges for a meeting with some of the kinswomen, which she does have, and offers them a deal for the kin to stay in Andor. Of course, this is following up on some of the information that we got regarding the fact that Egwene would like for Aes Sedai to be able to have the choice to choose to retire, basically, and if they choose to retire, the kin to be that thing, for them to be able to forsake the oaths if they want to, and then be able to live out their life how they please with the kin. And Elaine is basically trying to come to an agreement with some of the kin to potentially make Andor like a home for the kin to some degree, where, Aes Sedai could retire from the tower and live there. The kin might be able to make marriage a thing, relationships a thing that they do as a means of assuring the White Tower, or assuring the women that they are forsaking the White Tower politics and whatnot when they choose to retire from being Aes Sedai by, actually being able to have families or, whatever else it is that they want to have going on in their lives in Caemlyn. So there's some of that influence going on there. And Elaine's just well, you guys could stay in Andor, and the only thing that I would ask of you as the queen is that you offer free healing to people who need to be healed when they need to be healed, just as something that you guys do with the power. And then also that you guys provide traveling for different services, things like shipments or whatever else that the crown needs to be traveled with. And if there's any of that that could be done for profit, either for Caemlyn or for them, that they split the profits half and half, basically. Healing would be free, but traveling would be potential profit. But so the point is that the crown would be able to use the kin for healing and for traveling purposes, but that they would not be required to fight or do anything like that. Some of the kinswomen are planning to go back to the White Tower to do testing and become Aes Sedai and stuff like that. But there are some of the others who aren't. So Elaine is trying to, make headway with some of them to see what she can about, being able to use this political tool of women who can channel for some purposes, even if they won't fight. And because they won't fight, she also considers a little bit at the end of the chapter, specifically the possibility of potentially engaging the Black Tower in, being channelers of the power to use in army or war-related purposes. But again, that's another note that is not touched upon in the rest of this week's reading, but we'll probably see addressed a little bit later, especially since we got that scene of Nynaeve healing the madness of men. There might be a potential that we see a gathering of, Ashaman who are not loyal to, what's his bucket? The person who Rand set forth, Taim, that's his name, Azrim Taim, who leads the Black Tower, because it seems like Azrim Taim is kind of against Rand. Like, it seems pretty obvious to me that he's not really doing this for Rand's purposes, but rather for his own. So there might be a degree to which Ashaman, who are determined to actually be loyal to Rand and the Dragon Reborn instead of to Mazrim Taim, might be something where they are healed of their madness and stuff like that by Nynaeve, and also incorporated into the forces of Caemlyn, maybe. I don't know. This is just me like spitballing ideas of what could be happening there, but that is where that portion of things leaves off. Let's see. I did not actually finish everything with chapter 17, because the other scene that happens in chapter 17 is Matt, where we're going to switch to Matt POV for a little while, because of course, like I said, Elaine did get that letter from Matt that he wrote at the very end of last week's reading about trying to get an audience with her, so that, he can make headway with some of the things that he needs to get done. And in, planning to go to Caemlyn, or go into the city proper, Matt has a chapter or a scene in chapter 17 ahead of that where he encounters basically all the people he has been traveling with for the last handful of books leaving. He encounters all of the Shan-Chan who plan to go off with the Aes Sedai, who plan to go back to the White Tower. So the Shan-Chan are going to go with them because these Shan-Chan women are a Soldam. These are people who know that they have the ability to channel, or have the ability at least to learn how to. So they're going to go to the White Tower with the Aes Sedai. Sandar is also going to leave and go off that direction as well. He's going to leave Matt's company as well. So there's him leaving the company for the first time since like the Dragon Reborn, basically, I think is how long he's been in here. So he's going to disappear. Maybe he'll come back in the series, I don't know, but he leaves the company here at this point. Let's see, what other stuff happens here. Matt gives the Shan-Chan a task to actually learn how to channel so that they can play a part in reducing the potential dangers of Shan-Chan empirical collapse, when it's discovered that Soldam have the ability to learn how to channel, because Tuon is one of these people who's just like, hey, well, if you guys learn how to channel and you like kind of embrace this and try to make some sort of impact within Shan-Chan culture to some degree that like kind of proves that Soldam can channel, like make some sort of positive influence in that way, that's something that you should try to do. So he gives them that advice to try to do that. Matt does see them all off and has Teslin specifically go to take a message to the White Tower that they need to return the Horn of Valir to him soon. He doesn't mention the Horn of Valir specifically, but of course the Horn of Valir has been in the White Tower for a while. That is something that belongs to him, and he says, tell the Amyrlin, by the way, whether it's Egwene or whoever else, tell the Amyrlin that they have something of mine and they need to return it, or I will be returning to get it at some point soon. So preparing for the last battle with the Horn of Valir, so that's all fun and dandy. But some other Matt scenes incorporate him going into Caemlyn and actually, having a meeting with Elaine to some degree. Let's see, where is it? There it is, chapter 19, where Matt and Tom and Talmanes go to head into Caemlyn to meet with Elaine. Matt is questioned about some of the rumors of him by whoever's escorting him to actually meet with Elaine personally. He has questions about some of the things that he has done, some of which seem to be true, some of which aren't, some of which are like so outlandish. He's like, how in the world did this get attached to me? And some of which are uncomfortably true. It's just like, how do anybody know about this. There's some of that stuff going on, but they do all end up meeting with Elaine, or rather, Matt and Tom end up meeting with Elaine. Talmanes doesn't yet, but he assures Talmanes that he'll be able to meet Elaine, and he's able to ask Elaine in this chapter if she'll meet with him, and because she invites Tom and Matt to dinner like that day or the next day, and Talmanes is invited as well. That's personal stuff. I don't know why specifically Talmanes wants to meet Elaine so much. I guess it's worthy of note because I said it. But, Matt and Tom are able to meet with Elaine. That's the point of what happens in this chapter. Elaine welcomes them quite warmly, which actually surprises Matt a little bit. He wasn't expecting to be welcomed as warmly as he is, but Matt learns of the pregnancy of Elaine and also that Rand is the father. That's something that dumbfounds him a little bit. And in the meeting, Tom also tells Elaine about everything that has happened to them since they happened to split in Abu Dar, everything that has gone on since then, and everything except for the marriage between Matt and Tuon, which Matt chooses to keep hidden for the moment for pretty obvious political reasons. But Matt also warns Elaine that the Golem is in Caemlyn. That is something else that happens. Furthermore, Matt inquires with Elaine about getting the Bell founders to be able to make Eludra's dragons, and of course being able to supply the metal to be able to make those devices. There's some talk about what's going on with them, like these cannons basically that could launch things a very large distance, and that they could be modified to launch lots of little things to take out swaths of Trolloc hordes or something like that. So Elaine is actually rather ecstatic about this idea. She's like, yes, I will agree to this immediately because I would like to use them for the purposes of Caemlyn. Or for the purposes of my politics, personally, is basically how she puts it. She wants to use them and also the Band of the Red Hand, Matt's mercenaries, to, take Carrion. She wants to actually use them to secure Carrion because she wasn't sure how she was going to do that with all of the forces and mercenaries and backstabbers and stuff that she has in the city with her. She's just like, well, what if I just used you for my purposes now? And Matt's like, well, I don't know about that. But they do manage to come to an agreement where Elaine actually allows for this to be done, for the dragons to be made, and that if Matt and the Red Band decide to leave the service of Caemlyn, that they will have to leave a certain amount of the dragons with Elaine, but that they'll be able to take some of them with him. Other stuff like this, and Matt also has the particular insistence that the band will be at the last battle with Rand, and that Eludra will be the head of whoever's running the dragons. So agreements about stuff that's going on here, which is all really interesting stuff that I'm excited to see moving a little bit forward in the plot. But yeah, there's all of that, and then we're going to move on with further, I guess, the further development of Matt's plotline specifically, where he's trying to figure out how it is that he and Tom and Noel are going to end up being able to get into the Tower of Genji and also be able to get back out again. Matt investigates some rumors of himself throughout Caemlyn in the city, while Elaine has his Foxhead medallion, because that was also part of the agreement for all the dragons and stuff, was that Elaine would be able to have the medallion for like 3 days in which she could study it and then try to replicate it, basically. So while Elaine has his medallion, Matt is kind of waiting around the city. Like I said, he's investigating rumor of himself, basically disguising himself a little bit. He goes back and discusses the Tower of Genji with Tom and Noel. They gather some items from the Rime of the Snakes and Fox game to try to figure out like what it is that they're actually going to be able to do about, combating the Aelfin and Eilfin within the tower. And Matt has an idea to enter the city in a way to get the attention of Birgitte so that he can talk to her about it, because he happens to know that she knows how to get into the tower because she was the one that told Ulver about it. And that was how the others learned that there was a way to get into the tower that wasn't through, Viridian, where Matt happened to get there the first time. But yeah, so there's a meeting that happens between Matt and Birgitte where they talk about this. She basically tells him to stay away from the Tower of Genji and reveals that though she knows how to get in, and though she did actually get in once in one of her past lives, she reveals that she died there. She never made it out. She made it in once, but she never made it out. So that's concerning. Matt is convinced that he will still be able to live. He just wants to be able to get into the tower. He wants Birgitta to let him know how to get into the tower, but they are interrupted by, how shall we call it, Elaine's bond, depicting something very distressing happening, and that is because over the course of the next couple chapters, 23 and 24, switching right back to Elaine's POV once again, Elaine is continuing to play a little bit of politics by experiencing a performance, alongside some other Andorran nobles, including one whom her mother randomly one whom her mother put off late in her tenure, one that was particularly hurt politically by this purpose. So Elaine is trying to deal with politics on this front. Following this little event, this thing that they experience, this little bit of political foothold that she's trying to make, and it seems like she's able to make a little bit of headway there. But the main thing that happens in the chapter is that Egwene randomly decides to disguise herself and approach the captured Black Aja from the end of Knife of Dreams, when they were able to capture the Black Aja. She approaches them like a Forsaken would, all disguised and intimidating, trying to get information out of them. She's able to get a little bit out of them, the fact that they intend to kill Matt for some reason, but they intend to kill Matt, and there's also an approaching invasion in Caemlyn that she learns about. Nothing really more detailed than that. That's like the extent of what she learns about it. But she learns that happens, but she lets on a little bit too much that she's not, in fact, Forsaken, that she does not know enough for that to be the case, alerts the Black Aja to that, and everything just falls apart. The entire meeting falls apart. Things go very horribly wrong. Some of the Dark Friends escape. A couple of them die, I guess, including who was previously like the head of her guard, save for Birgitta, when she learns that this guy's a Dark Friend, and he's right behind her, and he stabs her in the belly, and puts her, and especially her babies, in a very extreme danger. Everything falls apart. Like I said, some of them escape. Lane is injured in the process, worried about her babies. It's all a mess. She gets found by Matt and Birgitta. She is healed. She's fine. The babies turn out to be fine, as revealed in chapter 24, where she is sentenced to a 1 week of bed rest by her midwife, criticized for doing what she did by Birgitta for, not letting her be there when she went to do something so hasty. She should have tried to plan this out a little bit more, but in either case, it is reported in the end that the Dark Friends have mostly escaped, except for the ones that died. She is able to give Matt his medallion back to him, because she had his medallion, like we mentioned before. Within the chapters, she was able to make one copy of the medallion that sort of worked, and there's some interesting dynamics between how she was able to actually survive the encounter in the first place, because the medallion, of course, does not prevent the wearer from channeling, so Elaine is able to channel while having the original medallion, but obviously somebody wearing the medallion does not allow them to be channeled against. You cannot channel against somebody who's wearing it. Her copy was kind of biffed a little bit, where it was able to guard against some weaves, not all of them, where like the original medallion was able to protect against some pretty heavy magic, but the copy that she was able to make, this imperfect copy, was able to guard against light weaves, low-level weaves, like weaker stuff, but the stronger stuff it wasn't able to resist as well. And there was also the fact that if you were holding or wearing that medallion, the fake medallion, or the copied medallion, I guess, you could not channel. For whatever reason, Elaine was not able to channel while holding the made-up medallion. So between having these two copies, the little bit of combat that happens in those chapters between her and the Forsaken and stuff, she was basically only able to survive because of the technicalities of who was holding what medallions and when and stuff, but the fake copied medallion was able to be stolen away. That was able to escape with the Dark Friends, but the original medallion is able to be returned to Matt. So I'm sure that what's going on there is all important, but that is everything to do with the Caemlyn storyline. I had a lot of fun with the Caemlyn storyline, actually. All the stuff, the interactions between Matt and Elaine particularly, were all very entertaining. I definitely enjoyed all of that. Maybe some of my favorite moments from the reading this week, But yeah, that is going to be everything with regard to that plot line. Let's go ahead and circle back around to Perrin's storyline, because there's a little bit to talk about here. Not a whole ton, all things considered. A lot of it's kind of stuff going on with Perrin's character personally within the Wolf Dream, and then a couple of information revelations. So in trying to get caught up with the rest of the storyline, we're actually taking a long time to do so, because at the end of last week's reading, I was just like, okay, we're right on the verge of Perrin going to war with the White Cloaks here, and it hasn't happened yet. Actually, there's 4 chapters of Perrin stuff going on, and they still have not gone to battle. Although I think this time it is true that they are just about to go to battle. In fact, the very next chapter that I'm about to start reading, to start next week's worth of reading for the next diary, is Perrin POV and Galad POV combined. So I'm pretty sure it's actually going to happen now. But in either case, we're trying to get up to that point. There's a little bit of stuff happening in the background, including Perrin having made petition for parley with the White Cloaks multiple times. All of those are, refused. They're pretty intent on battling Perrin, so he has to prepare for that a little bit. There's some POV of Zareen stuff going on where she handles administrative politics in the camp, all that kind of fun stuff. But there's one particular evening where Zareen talks with Perrin about him being a great leader despite his doubts. This is definitely something that is still very forefront within Perrin's POV, is his doubt of himself as a leader, and about his own personal control, how much he's able to actually control himself within the context of being a wolf brother and all the other stuff going on. He's worried about all of that, and that's why a lot of these next few chapters are him in the Wolf Dream for a few nights, is training to try to learn how to control that side of him a little bit more and come into a little bit more confidence in that way. So there's interesting interactions with that. It also reflects a previous chapter, which I didn't mention last week, where Zareen had told Perrin, like, you're a better leader than you think you are. It's okay, and has another moment like this. And also tries to inform them, just like, even if none of this happened, even if you stayed in the Two Rivers and you weren't leading this band right now, the Two Rivers has still changed. The Two Rivers had to change. It was changing and was going to change because of Trollocs and all of this other stuff going on. There's nothing you likely would have been able to do to stop that, and I think you are the best fit to lead all of these people now, so you should just accept that. But in either case, Chapter 16 is primarily dominated by the fact of Perrin and Zareen actually having a little anniversary evening together, which is actually more enjoyable than I was thinking it would be. They share a meal together. They express some of their feelings and fears with one another. Perrin's actually going into his fear with regard to being a wolf brother, and also the White Cloaks and all that kind of stuff. He explains what happened at the first time that he killed anybody, which was the White Cloaks a couple years ago, back in the early portion of the series. Zareen also tells him a little bit about what happened to her in Malden. There's also a little bit of what Perrin expresses as some of his worries with regard to Zareen there as well, because, like, well, while you were gone, Borderlands did this thing, and now there's rumors about me, and I can't handle these rumors either. There are these things about me that makes me a bad leader, and again, Zareen's able to comfort. It's just like, no, you're a good leader. All leaders have their faults, and all leaders have things that they have to overcome and stuff. That's normal. But she does assure Perrin that she's going to take care of Borderlands, basically. And Chapter 18 does have a Zareen POV where she does actually meet with Borderlands, making formal challenge to her if she does not find a way to squash the rumors about what Borderlands and Perrin were while Zareen was captured. And Borderlands just like, how do you expect me to do anything about that? Because Zareen making formal challenge and therefore maybe possibly killing Borderlands in the process would not do anything to stop the rumors, first of all. And second of all, Borderlands and the Mainers leaving the camp entirely would not do anything to squash the rumors. But Zareen's just like, yeah, well, I'm going to challenge you publicly and formally in X amount of time if you do not find a way to quash the rumors. So they come up with a plan. Borderlands is just like, okay, I'll take another man, and we will act as friends in each other's company within the camp, and that ought to, produce some sort of self-image between the two of us that allows the rumors to start to die down. So that was a entertaining little interaction to occur there. But moving back to Perrin's POV, since that's basically what the rest of this all is, we get to see Perrin in the Wolf Dream. I believe him being in the Wolf Dream is like 90% of what else happens in his POV here. It's not all of it, but it's a pretty significant chunk, and so Chapter 18 is part of this, where in the Wolf Dream, he investigates the White Cloak camp, not being able to find out who their leader is, because even though he's had interactions with Galad, he's not been able to figure out that Galad is the person that is leading the camp. And of course, if Morghese were to figure out that Galad's the one leading the camp, which I really hope that happens, because it would be really funny if it did, it could be very concerning. But in either case, that's something that's going on. But he does find Hopper in the Wolf Dream, and really over the next couple of scenes in the Wolf Dream, he starts training, learning how to actually use Tel'aran'rhiod and be in the Wolf Dream, but also not be there too strongly, whatever that means. I'm not entirely sure what it is Hopper means by coming into the dream too strongly, but Perrin does learn how to like keep himself in the dream, basically, because of course at the end of the last book, Hopper was like able to push him out of the Wolf Dream, basically, personally. Perrin's able to learn how to keep himself firm in the dream without being there too strongly, without losing himself into it, like when they were on their hunt. They also, have some stuff that they learn about, basically, Perrin, what's the next scene in the Wolf Dream? There it is. Basically learning the mechanics of Tel'aran'rhiod, where Perrin also learns how to shift in the world of dreams to go to different places where he wants to go, the way that the Aes Sedai have been doing for several books now at this point. So he learns how to do that. He also learns a little bit specifically about following scents in order to do that, to if somebody shifts away, being able to detect where they still are wherever they went and being able to go there directly, which is an interesting sort of twist on that mechanic. In the midst of training in Tel'aran'rhiod, you also have a moment where one of the wolves of one of the clans is actually killed in the dream by Slayer, and Perrin foolishly decides to try to go to stop him directly, barely survives the encounter, and when he is able to escape, again, just barely, Hopper admonishes him again, being like, hey, that was a very stupid thing to do, don't do that because you could die, you have not learned enough yet to actually face Slayer personally, so do not do that again. You have much to learn about the Wolf Dream, and one of those things that he learns in the Wolf Dream is that Slayer was actually able to manipulate the environment around him. This is something that Egwene was able to discover at one point in Tel'aran'rhiod, that the Aes Sedai have been able to use. It's just like, hey, we can sort of manipulate Tel'aran'rhiod personally to our purposes. It's not just changing the way that we appear within the dream, it's also we can like sort of change things about this world in and of itself to suit our purposes if we're like in a combat or a fight or something along those lines. Thinking and making things real within the dream. And evidently it is clear that Perrin is going to have to learn how to do this a little bit in order to solve the problem of Slayers. So that's an interesting little thing that occurs. But there is a couple other personal interactions that he has with some other people. Chapter 21 specifically sees Perrin learning a little bit about the state of the world, some political information being expressed to him by various different other people. He learns that Rand has been in Ered Daman to one point or another recently, and with regard to where his timeline is, that means that that would be Ered Daman at the beginning of The Gathering Storm, not Ered Daman in Chapter 25 that we talked about a little bit earlier. So not quite that yet, but a little bit earlier. So again, Perrin is still very much needing to catch up with the rest of the story here. He also learns that Darlin is now the king, the head of Tyr. He learns that Elaine now holds Andor here, and Perrin also wants to meet with her specifically, despite the implicit, tension between the two rivers and Caemlyn, the potential opposition there. Perrin wants to meet with her so that he can, express, learn what it is, what's actually going on, and tell her what it is that's actually going on with the Two Rivers folk there. So maybe potentially to diffuse any potential situation before it actually arises. Maybe, because that was also something that got mentioned in the the Elaine and Matt interactions, was that Elaine also kind of suggested that the Red Hand might have to be used against Perrin. And Matt's just like, I don't know about that. Why would that be the case? So that's another political tension that we're going to have to resolve a little bit later. But Perrin also is able to confirm a little bit of the rumor that there was once a Forsaken in Caemlyn, so that's some information that gets revealed again, finally, after very many books. The fact that Ravin, one of the Forsaken, was the head of Caemlyn for a little bit at the end of Morgase's tenure, and of course Morgase, who is disguised as Magdalene within the camp and as being a serving girl here in this particular meeting, causes her to basically freak out. She drops all of her stuff. She goes into a form of shock, basically, and she leaves after learning this information that Ravin was the one that she was manipulated by for so long. She reels from this information. Reels from learning that Ravin was her manipulator. She also knows that Valda had been her manipulator for a little bit. She's kind of disconcerted by this fact that these men have managed to manipulate her in this ruling positions and stuff like that. All of that stuff going on, which is concerning for her on a personal level. We also have a moment at the end where Morgase and Talonvor actually interact with each other. Talonvor has decided to basically volunteer to be one of the people that goes into Caemlyn so that he doesn't have to deal with Morgase anymore. He's just like, well, my approaches, my advances, my desire for you seems to be unrequited and unreciprocated, so I'm just gonna go ahead and leave because it's clear that you don't want me here. And Morgase is just like, no, you don't understand my complications with love as you seem to think with regard to Ravin and all these other, or with regard to Gabriel, who was actually Ravin, has nothing to do with you personally. This is all to do with me. I was manipulated in these ways. She's able to say, like, that person you think I was in love with, I was not in love with. I was manipulated. I was compulsed into that. So, just, don't make any hasty decisions. I just need to sort through my feelings about everything that's been going on. And Talonvor does decide to, revoke his volunteering to go to Caemlyn and decides to stick around for a little while she struggles with this. But at, backtracking back to that meeting that we just talked about a little bit as well, the meeting breaks up. Perrin sets for some of the refugees of Caemlyn to be sent home a little bit. He also sets for a meeting place to battle the White Cloaks to be set as well, because they are, again, pretty intent on actually fighting him. He also learns a bit from Balor specifically about why he hates the White Cloaks. He does not mention who his previous master was, which we of course know was, a White Cloak, who was murdered by other White Cloaks, but he hates White Cloaks because they murdered his previous master, and he's still very unhappy with them about all of that, of course. But yeah, the very last scene as well from Perrin's POV is following him waking from the wolf dream one of these other times where, he ponders over some of the training that he has in the dream. He has interactions with some other characters, like talking with Elias, the other wolf brother, about the state of being a wolf brother, taking solace in the fact that Elias did not lose himself to the wolf like one other character managed to at some other point in time. One of the things that Perrin fears is obviously losing himself completely to being a wolf. And so that's something that he talks with Elias about, and he's like, okay, well, I know that I can overcome this because Elias has overcome this as well, and I am also going to be fighting the White Cloaks tomorrow. So that is basically where his POV leaves off, and like I said, chapter 26, which is where we will begin with the book covering next week, is a Perrin and Galad POV, so we'll probably start to actually see that come into fruition with next week's reading. But yeah, that is everything for Towers of Midnight this week. Like I said, it was a lot of material, and my recording for this is an hour and a half long, which is not fantastic. I really hate that. But we managed to get through everything, and yeah, hopefully the next couple diaries will be a little bit shorter than this on account of them covering slightly less material than this week's coverage actually is. But in either case, I have been enjoying the book. I do think there were some structural issues. Just trying to organize it in this way to be able to talk about it in this video was a headache, much more of a headache than I would like, but it has been an enjoyable read nonetheless. As for next week, I think my plan is to be able to get through chapters 26 through 41. The exact chapter count of where I end might shift a couple depending on how things are going, but as far as making pretty good progress. I'm going to try to get to chapter 42 next week, and then the last week ought to be a little bit shorter. So that is the goal. If you are reading along, that is where I plan to get to for next week. But otherwise, that is going to be the end of this week's diary. But because I have wasted, quote-unquote wasted, so much time in this video, it still managed to be very long, even though I tried to not cover things in very much detail. I just happened to have a little bit more commentary this week than I expected. In either case, I really appreciate you for watching this video if you did. I hope to see you guys in next week's diary, and of course the last one as I continue this book. I have been really enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to continuing. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.